This is it, ladies and gentlemen. This is your conversational collapsing anchors model. Usually what stops us from trusting our intuition, or from even getting into the resource state so that we have an intuition that's worthy of trusting, is things in our life that make us feel less than resourceful. Triggers, anchors in our external environment that remind us of limitations. And when we believe those limitations long enough, they become self-fulfilling prophecies, and we live by limitation. But it doesn't have to be that way. Because there is a way of collapsing those anchors. This is your conversational collapsing anchors approach. And it's much more than that, because it utilizes beyond goals after the conversational collapse. How to collapse those anchors that prevent your success and happiness. And how to be inspired by end-state energies to make appropriate choices in that particular context. You're about to learn the most versatile coaching model that I've ever known of. Okay? And you're going to learn the basic form today. At Masters, you'll learn advanced applications and other nuances of it that add a whole new level of profoundness to it. The basic level is already profound. Okay, let's see how this works. When the client comes in for the session, what's the first thing you do? You already know. What's the very first thing you're going to elicit? The problem. Now, what's the most important anatomy of the problem that you must have in order to do important work? What must you elicit as the first thing that fires that problem? Client's not having a problem, client's not having a problem, they're going through the day, they're just fine, and suddenly they're having a problem. What got them into the problem state? It's called a trigger. Now we're going to work in one context, because that way it keeps it clean and the whole part of your mind knows what to do with the changes that we integrate here in the session. So in which area of your life do you want to work through? Where is this problem taking place? You know, most of the time. Oh, it happens there, there, and there. Okay, where's it the biggest problem for you? We work at the most fundamental level. We'll talk about other situations afterwards, but let's focus on the one, keeps the work clean, it's much more powerful, okay? Yeah, that's fine. Client talks about that. Okay, now, how do you know it's time to have that problem? Trigger. Get very, very curious about the trigger, because the extent to which your trigger elicitation is accurate will determine the success of the model. What's the very first thing that you become aware of, which up until that moment in time the client wasn't aware of, but now they are, through the questioning, becoming aware of what is the trigger? What's the very first thing that triggers the problem? You could ask the question, what's the very first thing that triggers the problem? And they may give you a whole smear. Very rarely will their response to that question be the precise trigger. Sometimes it is, but rarely. You usually have to go fishing at this stage, asking a lot of questions about the last moment in time where they were fine to that next moment where they were not fine anymore. And what's the very thing that they saw or heard that lets their unconscious mind know, boom, to enter the unresourceful state. It's a precise stimuli. It's not just the clock on the wall, it's the clock on the wall at 10 o'clock. That's how precise it is. For example, what state does that put them in? So you see the clock at 10 o'clock and it makes you feel what way? What happens? Yeah. And also AD, what's going on in your head? How does it make you feel? What are you saying to yourself? Is it necessarily the trigger first or the state first? Doesn't really matter. How do you feel? I get this. Often clients will talk to you about the feeling that they get. They're not aware of the trigger, but it's through identifying what the unwanted feeling is, you say, what's the first thing you notice that lets you know now's the time to have that feeling? So there that thing happens, you get that feeling, and what do? Well, what am I asking about? The unwanted reaction. What's the behavior that it results in that you'd like to change? We must have these 4 things before we can continue. And we must be exceptionally accurate about the elicitation of the trigger. Otherwise, you can do a great job with the rest of the model, and it's just not sustainable. Why? Because the trigger continues having the old effect on their neurology, and you didn't create change at the train station. Now the train's left, and the client's got all this great stuff in their awareness that they can do and think about later on, but it's too late, because that train's going down the old trail of thought and behavior. Elicit the context, the trigger, the state, and unwanted behavior. Then I talk about the blue sky, the cold water, the lunch, in other words, break state. And then I go, now, that's how you've been. How do you want to be different? And I'll be quite vivid, perhaps, if I'm going to use that question. Look at my analog markings. Pointing towards the person's recall side. That's the way you've been. How do you want to be different? Pointing towards their construct side. Why would I be pointing to the construct side now when I'm eliciting the outcome? I want them to create an image, and I'm actually encouraging them to look up to their construct side, because you need to construct an image of your desired outcome. What happens if the client looks to recall and they're supposed to be answering the question, what do you want instead?
They're remembering a feeling that they had that was similar to what they're wanting to have?
Could be, but at this stage, they're most probably still focused on the problem. And they're going to tell me more about what they don't want. So I actually want to force a constructed eye access at this stage. And what I mean by force is very gently encourage them to come up with something new beyond what they've thought before. Another way of putting that question is, that's what you've been focusing on. And while all your attention is on that, what's everything else in the background of your awareness that you weren't focusing on until right now? Remember that question. It's not the first time I'm giving it to you. The unconscious elicitation of the outcome. So while you're focusing on all of that, and all your attention is fixated on that in this context, what's everything else that you weren't focusing on that you can right now? Now I want to know, what do you want instead? I'm asking my client to do something that you can't really do too consciously. They'll probably give me a blank stare. And if I see a blank stare, my first response is, that's right. Now what do you want instead? Do you get that?
Yeah.
I've just got them into a void state, a beyond word state for a moment. And from that more expanded state, I'm saying, what do you want instead? I'm going to get more of a pure, unconscious mind motivated outcome than the calculated, analyzed, cognitive, thought about one, which is why they think they've come for coaching. But there's something deeper that brought them to the coaching. And I want to know what's that outcome. And that's what the question is designed to provoke. Will it necessarily give you that information first time around? Maybe, maybe not. Ask the question, see where the client goes, and you're calibrating to their unconscious communication all the time. Is it a congruent outcome? Then it's well formed. The other option is to take them through the well-formed outcome questions at this point in time, remembering that that's useful too, but it's asking questions mainly to their conscious mind. However, constructive questions that make them think deeper and differently, and also will fish out any secondary gain that might be lurking around in the background there. So, what they want must be positively stated. If they say, well, I don't want to have that problem anymore, I'm going, that's right, I know you don't. So let's put that problem behind you right now. And I might go, just take that problem and put it right behind you right now so that you can focus on what you want instead and move towards that. And therefore, what is it that you're moving towards now that the problem's behind you? And when they start to talk about this desired outcome, I'm looking for a physiological shift into a physiology that resembles the desired state. If I don't see a physiological shift at this stage, they're not accessing a resourceful internal representation, which I need them to at this stage. Constructed eye access tells me they're creating this desirable picture in their head. And then I ask, and what are the behaviours related to your outcome? What do you want to be able to achieve, to do? How would you like to respond to the situation? You used to react in this way. What's the new response that you want instead? Now I've got that valuable information, I move on to step 3. Associate the client into the end state energy. I say to my client, thank you for that wonderful outcome. Now, I want you to be there in that thing you've just described to me. So, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, olfactory, gustatory. Now I know what that outcome is. Can you remember a time when you felt that way before? Do you know anybody else who is that way that you could imagine being right now, just as a way of accessing the state? Use my language to get them to recall or to imagine, and then bring it into the present tense as you're having that full experience, seeing, hearing, feeling, smelling, tasting, having that experience right now as you see the glaring eyes in that situation. How do you respond? I use glaring eyes as the trigger. To get them fully associated, I use their words, and more specifically, their words that describe the quality of that experience. And there's a lot of energetic difference between associated and dissociated. If the person's in the scene, and the elephant's there, and the lion's there, and the hippos are down there, and it's a surround sound and scene of being fully associated, is a very different energy from seeing themselves in the picture and all the animals. The dissociated is never as intense, but that doesn't matter to me as much as using exactly what the client gave me. Their words, their way of describing the picture. And when I'm eliciting what the resource states are, I'm asking, are you in the picture, or are you looking at yourself in the picture? See, I am eliciting submodalities. Because sometimes they may not tell me. Frequently they will, but if they don't, then I'm going to ask. Because if I've got those submodality qualities, then it makes a big difference. So you get them there now, and they're fully beaming. They're in a wonderful resource state, and as you calibrate to them being in that resource state, you say, see that trigger, or hear that trigger. What happens now? And they go, depending on the intensity of your resource state, anything from, wow, gee, I see it completely differently now, through to, nothing much. That's the first collapse. That trigger is an anchor. This is the first collapse of the anchor. Remember, this is a collapsing anchors technique. And the first thing you ought to experience at this stage is the client going, oh, that was great. And then you introduce that thing. The first collapse is usually a state of, why take away this wonderful state that you've just given me with that thing? Confusion as the two states start to amalgamate in the neurology. It's just the first time. You're going to do it 3 to 5 times, all right? Because I want to create a strong anchor. The first collapse, the triggers may be still bigger in terms of energy than the first one. That's why it hasn't completely collapsed yet. I don't expect the first collapse to collapse it, although it can happen. If you get a big energy here, and this is not so bad. 3 to 5 collapses with a breaker state between each. Each time we'll chip away at it. All right. Now, tell me about another time when you felt happy, confident, resourceful, powerful, strong, courageous, whatever the resource states are that are relevant to this collapse, that are relevant to that desired outcome. Now, they're having this experience. 5 sensory, see, hear, feel, smell, taste. Being there now. Introduce the trigger again. So now I've got them vividly associated into the end state energy again. A new example, same energy, second collapse of the trigger. So I've collapsed it with 2 examples of freedom, because that's my client's end state energy. Great, we've collapsed it twice. Break state. Super. Now, freedom is so important to you. Can you think of another time when you really felt free? And I'm animating it because I want my client to go there in the physiology, because it helps them to come up with the memories easier. Anytime, childhood to yesterday, anytime in between, when you really felt the way you want to feel freedom. Yeah, well, come to think of it, it was the first time I flew on a plane overseas. And, and I'm sitting on the plane, and those engines start to roar as it starts to push down the runway for takeoff. That feeling, the first time I felt it, was just amazing. So now, as you're there in the plane, and you hear the engines starting to roar, and you feel your back pressing, I'm using my client's words, not my own. So my example now is the words my clients would have given me. And you feel your back push up against the seat, and the plane starting to lift as it takes off into the sky, and you feel that freedom in your body right now. See the clock at 10 o'clock. And the client starts to go, and I'm seeing, what's this called? You're actually searching for something within your repertoire of experiences, and you can't find it momentarily, so you're in a process of searching so that you can derive something, a trans-derivational search. The mixing of the trigger state and the third collapse is starting to go, it's mixing the state neurologically. There's new neurons going, there's electricity going on inside him and her, and that means the two states, unwanted and desired states, are blending, so that the trigger no longer fires the old state. When it's fully collapsed, it won't do what it used to do neurologically anymore. Usually at the third collapse, I'm already starting to see that the trigger doesn't do the problem anymore. I introduced the clock at 10 o'clock. In the past, clock at 10 o'clock, and they used to go into the unwanted state straight away. Now, clock at 10 o'clock, and they're going, yeah, and they're not exactly jumping for joy, but the clock at 10 o'clock is no longer having its effect on them, where they used to get anxiety. So now I've done 3 collapses. I usually go for 4 to 5. So the 4th one would be another example of where the client felt freedom. I would vividly associate my client into that state of freedom. And at the peak of that state, and only at the peak, that's why you learned anchoring before, only at the peak of that state do I introduce the trigger. How do you know how many times, actually? How do you know? How do you know when you're done?
TDS.
When you're done, there's no longer a TDS.
When they no longer associate with the trigger that issue they have.
Yes. You introduce the trigger and the client's going, the old clock. What a joke. I can't believe it used to have that effect on me. In other words, it doesn't result in the unwanted state and the old unwanted reaction anymore. The trigger has no negative energy associated to it anymore. It's just a thing. They can still think about it. Probably the picture has changed big time. The submodalities will have shifted in some form or another. Certainly the way they respond to it will have changed. Step 4, once again, does the stacking. So at the peak of the first one, you introduce the next one. At the peak of that, you introduce the next one. And at the peak of the top of all my states, in my client's example, as the wheels lift off the ground and he feels that freedom. Now in that state, what's your next smallest achievable little step that you can take that leads towards your desired outcome? And I emphasize small because I don't want them to come up with the next hugest step that causes them to procrastinate. What's the next smallest achievable little step that you know you can take, possibly in the next 24 hours, that lets you know you're on your way? The ball is rolling. I elicit that next smallest step. I get them to imagine taking that next smallest step. I get them to imagine feeling really good about taking that next smallest step. And I coach them a little bit about that. And this is the model you got handed yesterday on a sheet of paper towards the end of the day, the one that I've created, which is the proactive coaching model. It's just a clean coaching model. When it comes to that next smallest step and they're visualizing taking it, I'm telling them a bit about You can feel so good taking that step because you know where it's leading to you in your life. And you can feel all that good energy associated with where you're going each step of the way because you know where that leads you, don't you? Tag question, and now I'm calibrating to their unconscious response. I want to see a congruent response at this stage. And if I get a congruent response, then that means their unconscious minds have accepted the suggestion that they're going to feel the end state energy each and every step of the way. And that's how they know they're on the right track. And they can get back on track when they realize that what I'm doing right now doesn't make me feel so good. I'm sort of not really on the best path for me. And so this is where I give my clients a skill, something to take home. I say, right, here's how you associate into the end state energy again. And when you're feeling really good, ask yourself, what's the next smallest step I can take to moving in this direction in my life? And take the first one that comes to mind. And keep going. That's how you get yourself back on track. And then I test. I go, about that, the first test is very vague. About that thing that you spoke about in the beginning that used to be a problem for you, once again, it's in the past. How do you think about that now? If they go, oh, I still get a bit of that feeling, start the whole process again. This time you can move through the process much quicker because you've already primed their unconscious mind. You've oiled the wheel, okay? You go through it again, but 3 times the speed. You don't have all the setup and pre-framing to do anymore, okay? Cool. You don't have to re-elicit this and this. You actually just start step 3 again. You just recycle step 3 and 4. Okay? The second test is, now see those glaring eyes. Ah, not a problem. Okay, now imagine a time in the future. Oh, that's good too. Great. How are you feeling about that? Super, I can't wait to take on the rest of my life. If I'm not completely happy with my client's congruent response, in other words, if I sense an incongruent response, get back to step 3. Maybe I didn't do this part accurately. Maybe I need to get back to another trigger. Maybe I do need to go back to step 1. If I sense that, I think I've missed the trigger here, go back and elicit it again. Be flexible. I collapsed this one in this context. But now, my client at the beginning of the session smeared it on me. All right, oh, I have this problem in that part of my life, and that, and it happens there, and it happens there too, and it's just like the story of my life. Huh? Okay, let's deal with one story at a time. So now he's in the resource state, we collapse the trigger. And now, this is where, if you've got experience and at Master Practitioner, we really drive this, how you can generalize that out into other contexts. What you can know for now is, this one's collapsed, you've got a next smallest step, he's like feeling much better and he knows what he's going to do. And then I'll use hypnotic language. And I'm wondering, in how many other areas of your life you can feel, boom, and I'll take them right through that, full association, that way. And think about now how you're responding when you're at home with your wife, when you're dealing with that other client, when you're talking to your kids, when you're here, when you're there. And because I've grown a strong root to dealing with this problem, I'm now creating capillaries or subsidiary roots. So the neural network spreads and integrates more deeply, generalizing it across to these other contexts. But I definitely do focus the coaching initially on the presenting problem in one context and make the generalization, integration stuff at the end as just a way of spreading it through the person's life. They're doing a whole lot of future pacing. That's all they're doing. A whole lot of future pacing in these other contexts. Keeping it clean though, one main context per session, and you can do that generalizing language at the end of the session. If you elicit the end state energy, and it is not a high intense energy state, it's like relieved, satisfied. In other words, they've been procrastinating, that was the problem. How will you feel to just get it done? Such a relief. That's satisfying. It's, for that person, that's a highly resourceful end state. And you chunk them up, they're like, you know what, just that relief, just the letting go and knowing I've got it done. The in-laws came for dinner, it went well, they've left, and I can just sit back, I can have my cigarette, I can have my glass of wine, and I can just, that's all I'm after. It's a low energy state. Good low energy state. But it's not the end state energy that I need. So what I'm going to say to the person is, okay, now as you're there and you've got your cigarette, and you've got your glass of wine and you're feeling present tense language, associating them straight into that, I'm going to say, how will it feel just moments before the inevitable success of that relieved state, when you know that everything is going to go well because you're so well prepared and you've done whatever it takes, and it's that moment before the achievement of your goal. How do you feel? So I'm asking them to think back to what they would have been doing in order to make sure of achieving the goal so that they can feel relieved and satisfied. And think about that in your own minds now. What kind of energy do you suppose the client, or what kind of scenario with an energy associated to it, do you think the client will associate into before the relieved state, when they know that achieving their desired outcome is absolutely inevitable? I used the parents-in-law. The table is set. All the courses of the meal are prepared. Everything is ready. Bottles of wine are open. You've thought of everything. And you're completely prepared, and they're about to arrive. How are you feeling now? Excited, confident, accomplished. What kind of energy is associated to these states? That's high energy states. Like, well, I've done it. Yes, good, excellent. I'm ready. Superb. All right. Done the bathroom, done everything. Totally ready. It's going to be a great evening. So what I'm after is a high energy state. This just before, if necessary. It's necessary when the end state is a low energy state. Because you must have a high energy state to bring back to this. The high energy state, because it needs to be bigger than this. More intense than this. That's what creates a collapse anchors. So I want to know what the next smallest step is. That way I get to check, is it achievable?
So they tell you that?
Yeah. A little bit of, I might even have a little conversation with the client if I think the next step is not something that's so easy to achieve. Sometimes people think that they're selecting a small step, but when you really look at it, it's a charged thing for them to do. You know, for example, phoning a lawyer. That might be the very thing they weren't willing to do before. I want to make sure that the step they take leads to the fulfillment of other steps down the line that are important, but all we care about right now is the next smallest one that's inspired by the end state energy. And my task, which is, that is their task that I'll set for them to do after the session, but my future pace is tomorrow, when you're taking that step. Right now, I want you to see yourself taking action on that, taking that next step, and feeling the end state energy as you do take that step. I'm actually associating them a bit into the state of freedom through the step. So guess what? The step itself is inspired and feels great because It's linked to the end state energy. That's why cleaning my desk was the most fun I'd ever had, cleaning my desk ever before. Because it was linked to the end state energy. As I started cleaning my desk, I knew the purpose behind it. I knew where I'm going with this. And I felt the end state energy while cleaning my desk. And if I'm feeling the end state energy while I'm taking this next step, that is what lights up the next step, and the next step, and the next step. But I don't know what they'll be until I take the step before. When a car drives along the highway at night, it gets to its destination because the driver knows where he or she is going. But they never see more than about 20 meters ahead. You don't need to. You've got a mental picture of where you're going, and you know that just seeing in front of you is good enough. So know where you're going, be in the right state, and take the next step.